And I will say, we're not going to get all the way through Acts chapter 17. I make these predictions that I want to get through whole chapters and things like that. There's just too much in this chapter. So I want us to be able to take the time to go through it, give it the time that it deserves, and hopefully see some things that will be profitable for all of us as well. I think in particular in this chapter, there are some important lessons that we can learn about how we, first of all, present the message of the gospel, and secondly, how we receive the message of the gospel. And so maybe we'll try to highlight some of those things as we go on. So just catching up where we are in our story, in our history, Paul and Silas and Timothy are on that second missionary journey. We left them last Wednesday in Philippi. And you recall that is the location where they meet Lydia and the women who are praying down by the river. And then they are eventually put into prison for because they cast out the spirit from the young servant girl. And then, of course, the account of the Philippian jailer and everything that happens with that. And some really good points made last week about what we see there is the seeds of the Philippian church that we read about in the letter to the Philippians, and how generous they are and how willing to give of themselves on Paul's behalf. And so once we get to that letter, you definitely see how that work has flourished, even in the midst of a city where they endured such persecution. Tonight, we're going to see a similar type of situation with Thessalonica. Okay? So Thessalonica is about 100 miles or so south of Philippi. The text tells us in Acts 17:1, just kind of diving in, then they traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia and came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. Okay, so just thinking for a brief moment about Thessalonica. Okay, Thessalonica is named after Thessaly, who was, I believe, the sister-in-law of Alexander the Great. Thessalonica plays an important part in the history of Rome because in the civil war between Augustus and Brutus and Cassius, they side with Augustus. And then they are rewarded for that. So Thessalonica becomes a free city. And indeed, they become the capital of the region of Macedonia, or of the province of Macedonia. At the time of Paul visiting there, it is estimated that there were about 200,000 people in the city of Thessalonica. That is a large city. That is just over half of the population of the city of Lexington. So a lot of folks in that city, a very affluent city. It's a city that's near the coast. It's a city that is on what's known as the Egnatian Way. And so all of these towns that Paul is going to on this part of his journey are along that highway. They are just one right after the other along that Egnatian Way. It's a very famous highway in that province. Within Thessalonica, just thinking about the people and thinking about their prominence within Roman history, there is a heavy Roman influence in this town. They are under the auspices of Rome. They have local government that's set up, which we're going to see those in just a minute. But there is also a substantial Jewish population. One of the first things that we see here in verse 1 of chapter 17 is that there is a Jewish synagogue. And so most of the cities that Paul has been to thus far have had one. Some have not. Philippi was one of those that we assume does not have a synagogue because it's not mentioned in Acts 16, and that's why they go down to the river for their prayer meetings. Thessalonica does have a synagogue, and Paul spends some time there. So let's just read through about the first 8 verses of Acts 17, and then we'll proceed from there. Then they traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia and came to Thessalonica, where there was a Jewish synagogue. As usual, Paul went to them and on 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and showing that the Messiah had to suffer and rise from the dead, and saying, "This is the Messiah Jesus, whom I am proclaiming to you." Then some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, including a great number of God-fearing Greeks, as well as a number of the leading women. But the Jews became jealous, and when they had brought together some scoundrels from the marketplace and formed a mob, they set the city in an uproar. Attacking Jason's house, they searched for them to bring them out to the public assembly. And when they did not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city officials, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here too, and Jason has received them as guests. They are all acting contrary to Caesar's decrees, saying that there is another king, Jesus." The Jews stirred up the crowd and the city officials who heard these things. So, taking a security bond from Jason and the others, they released them. All right, so let's pause there. So this is the account of Thessalonica. Okay? All right, so what I want us to see, it's the same pattern that we've seen in many of the other cities, especially those that have synagogues in them. Paul makes his way to Thessalonica, and they make their way to the synagogue and begin teaching and preaching there. And it says that they did so over 3 Sabbath days. So for at least 3 weeks, Paul and his companions are there teaching about the gospel. Okay? So there is some level of tolerance for hearing the gospel message there. And especially from what we see from the reaction to it there. What I want us to see in this account, kind of step back for a minute, before we get to the substance of it, I want to see the method of how Paul teaches. And hopefully maybe there's some things that we can pull from this about how we teach. The reason I want to talk about this is because whenever we have studies on evangelism, I don't know about you, but when I'm sitting in the pew and we're learning about how to evangelize, either knocking on doors or passing out tracts or whatever, I find myself, if I'm just being honest, sitting in the seat and kind of shrinking a little bit because I don't like knocking on doors. We also might think of evangelizing as going out to the street corner, maybe in Phoenix Park downtown, and just pulling out a Bible and just start yelling or preaching out loud. And we might think of that as evangelism. And to be honest, sure, that is a method of evangelism. You could very well do that. And if that is your chosen method, God bless you and God bless your efforts, because that is a worthy thing to do. But for many of us, thinking about doing something like that gives us a lot of anxiety. We don't want to go out there and look like a crazy person. We don't want to be treated like a crazy person. And we don't want to meet with resistance and questions that are inevitably to come when we do that, if people give us the time of day. Okay, so either if you're in downtown Lexington or if you go onto UK's campus or something like that. What I think that we see here is a method of evangelism that we don't often think of. Paul's method of evangelism here is not to stand up and pontificate about the gospel, just preaching it at anybody who passes by. When they go to the synagogues, I think what we get here is kind of a magnifying glass of how Paul and his companions teach the gospel. And again, I'm one of those people, I love word studies because I believe that all words used in Scripture are used with purpose. And so I want to dive into some of these words and just maybe kind of get some contextual meaning from them. Okay, so the way that Paul is described his teaching here in verse 2 and 3, it says, first of all, he reasoned with them from the Scriptures. Okay, so this is the word dialegomai. You may think of a word that sounds similar to that. What sounds similar to dialegomai? Dialogue, okay? And so what is a dialogue then? Okay, Mike gives me this signal. Yeah, I'm getting it's a back and forth, right? Okay, it's a conversation. And so that's what Paul's doing. He's not standing up and yelling at people. He's sitting with these people, or he's standing among these people, and he is speaking back and forth with them. And he's giving them a chance to speak as well. Okay? So we have a dialogue. We have a discussion happening here. Easy enough way to do that. And it says that this dialogue was from the Scriptures. So Paul is going to Scriptures that they are most likely reading within their synagogue service. Remember, they're reading the Shema, they're learning about Moses, they're reading from the prophets and the poets and the books of wisdom, and then they're praying based on those. And so Paul is most likely going to those places that they are familiar with, and he's just kind of going through that with them and kind of pointing some things out. Okay? So the second thing he does then, as he's doing that, it says that he explains. Similar word, dianoigo, and the word means to open completely. And I love that definition. Because what's happening is that Paul, as he's going through these Scriptures and as he's kind of having this back and forth with folks in a conversational manner, he is explaining the larger context of what's involved in these Scriptures. Yes, as Jews in the synagogue, and believing Greeks, kind of as an addition, but as Jews in the synagogue, they are most likely familiar with all the stories they're reading, just as most of us probably are. We've been raised with them. Those everyday stories from creation through Moses, through the judges, through the kings, through the prophets, all of that stuff. We're familiar with that. Now the question is that as you're growing up with those stories, and as you begin to come to kind of a more fuller knowledge of the Bible story, and then as it leads into the New Testament, what we've got to see, as Romans tells us, is how are these things beneficial for us? Because everything that was written in the past was written to teach us, so that through the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. If you remember that passage from our spiritual heritage, remember? Okay? So what Paul is telling us then is that every single thing in the Old Testament was written for our knowledge, our encouragement, and our instruction, so that our hope can be built on that. When Paul is going to these places and he's beginning to explain this, he's saying, yes, there are these stories that you're familiar with. Yes, there are these passages that you have memorized. Now let's see where they have led, or where they are leading or have led. And so that's what he's doing. He is opening completely those passages. And this word, we see it in other passages in Scripture. Mark chapter 7, when Jesus is opening the eyes of the blind, this word is used because he does it completely. He doesn't do it by halves. And then in Luke chapter 24, after Jesus has been resurrected and he is appearing to various groups and his disciples and the people along the Emmaus Road, that he is opening their eyes to the fullness of the Scriptures and to all of the Scriptures that talked about him as the Messiah. And then, as we just read a couple of weeks ago, Acts chapter 16, and talking about Lydia, this same word is used of her heart, that it was open completely as Paul was expounding on these things and teaching these people. So opening completely the Scriptures is the next thing that Paul is doing. And then this last part, it says that he is proving, or I think some of the words might say asserting or something to that effect. But he is proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead. Okay? So this is the hardest one of these words to say. Paratithemos, I think, is the correct. Paratithemos. So to set before, or to entrust, or commend. Okay? So often at the end of a service, one of the elders or whoever's doing announcements will get up after David has given a lesson that day and say, "We commend this lesson to you." Okay? Now, we hear that and we say, they're commending it to us as if to say, "I approve of this message, and so should you." But what they're actually doing is basically handing that message to you and saying, take this and glean from it. Take this and use it. And that's what's happening here. When it says that he was proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer. So Paul is walking them through the scriptures and talking about how those scriptures apply to the Messiah and showing that that Messiah had to suffer. And then it's as if he's kind of wrapping it all up with a bow and handing it to them and saying, now you draw conclusions. Now you tell me what this means. Okay? Or you tell me if I'm wrong. He's basically just laying it out there before them. Okay? Now, I said that I think that there's ways that we can learn from this in terms of evangelism. And so maybe think about it this way. I hope you can see that a little bit. Okay? So same words, reason, explain, and prove. Okay? So reasoning, doing the same thing, we can do the same thing that Paul does. Just presenting evidence. And by presenting evidence, I just mean tell the story of the Bible. That's one of the whole reasons that when we did the spiritual heritage class, that's basically what we were trying to do with the little mini story was, here is a way that I can within 30 to 45 seconds tell you the entire main story of the Bible. Okay, from point to point, from era to era. It's just an easy way to lay the whole thing out there. So just tell the story. That's all it is. All those stories are there. We've most likely been raised with them or are familiar with them. Just tell the story and present the evidence. Okay, and then explain. So as I said, provide context for those stories. Each of the stories that we learn as children, or as we learn just kind of the elementary principles, we learn about Daniel in the lion's den. We learn about Noah and the ark. We learn about Adam and Eve. How do those things connect? In what context do those events happen? Okay, so Moses and the children of Israel find themselves down in Egypt because of everything that came before that. Okay, and then they go on to the promised land because of everything that came before that, and so on and so forth. So provide context and then show connections. As you're going through the Old Testament, as you're going through the Bible story, start making those connections. Start making those hyperlinks to New Testament principles. Okay? So I've got this labeled as show the red thread. Does everybody know what I mean by the red thread? Okay, so the red thread basically just means it's the thread that goes all the way through. It's the thing that connects everything. And so you just follow the pathway through the Bible. So provide context and show connections. And then prove. Now this I think is the part that gets to us. Because once we tell the story and once we start drawing connections, inevitably the next thing somebody will say is, prove it. Prove that it is. We don't have to prove everything. What we're doing is presenting. That's really what it means to evangelize. Okay? We are merely presenting the information and inviting the audience to draw the conclusion. So to whom or to what does all of that evidence point once we have gone through this process? And then you leave it at that. That is evangelism. Okay? Now, certainly, once all that happens, you've planted a seed, that seed needs to be watered as well. And so that's certainly where Bible classes and further study and follow-up and all of those things are. But those aren't the things that we're scared of. What we're scared of is the initial contact. And that's all this is an initial contact. Let's get together. Let me just tell you about the Bible story, what I know, and then let's draw some conclusions based on that. Any thoughts or anything on what?
My mind goes back to Luke 4, where Jesus went to the synagogue in Nazareth.
Yeah.
And they gave him a copy of the scriptures. He found Isaiah 62, read from it, closed it up and said, today this scripture is fulfilled in your midst.
Right.
He did the very reason.
Yep.
He just simply said, here it is, this is what it says, this is what it means. Yep. It essentially said it's pointing at me, but that was
right.
That that was essentially what Paul was doing here, except Paul said it's not pointing to me, it's pointing to Jesus.
Right. Yep, sure is. Now, in just a second, we're going to get to the result of the conversation, and the result where Jesus was concerned didn't go great. And in this one, it'll be mixed results. But any other thoughts? Pretty simple? Seems simple on paper. I understand that. I realize that. And, probably none of us are going to go up to the complete stranger on the street and just say, do you want to study? And let me go through all this stuff. But as we run across acquaintances, as we talk to our relatives and our friends, co-workers even, this is just a simple way to present the gospel story, because that's what we're called to do. We are not called to force anyone to make up their mind. We are not called to present every single little bit of evidence that we can possibly think of. All we are called to do is to tell the story, to tell what we know, and ask where it leads. And from that point, then you can go on to talk about what that story means to you. Okay? All right, so that kind of gets to the next part of this then. So I said that there were three things here: reasoning, explaining, and proving. But then Paul goes on to round out this message. And what he says is that this Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ. Okay? So two questions to ask then here. First of all, what is Paul concluding? If the whole point of this exercise is to bring someone to a conclusion, and hopefully they will come to the conclusion that you're trying to lead them to, not out of any personal motives, but because that's the point of the gospel, to whom does all the evidence point? So what is Paul concluding? First of all, the scriptures point to a Messiah who would suffer and die and be resurrected for all men. Okay? Now remember, he is talking to just kind of your commonplace Jews in the synagogue. And so what kind of, based on your knowledge of the Jews and their concept of the Messiah, what was their thoughts on what the Messiah was going to be? What do you think? An earthly king, okay. And there's lots of kings. What kind of earthly king?
Well, it seems like they wanted someone who delivered them.
Okay, all right.
They were still under a form of bondage.
Yes. Okay, yeah, and so we see a lot of the Jewish groups of that day looking forward to a Messiah that was going to come in and put them back in their rightful place. If you remember, shortly before Jesus is born, within about 100 years, the Jews had a kingdom, the Hasmonean dynasty. They had a kingdom once again. They were prominent, they were well known, they were established. And then slowly, due to infighting and then the influence of Rome and other factors, that kingdom started to crumble apart. But what we saw within that kingdom was they had a concept of, we want to reestablish the kingdom that Solomon had, and we want to make it better. And we're going to do that through the Messiah. The Messiah is going to come, and he's going to bring us out of oppression from Rome, and he's going to lead us to prominence again. Okay? And so that seems to be many of their, let me put it that way, I don't want to speak for everyone, many of their concept of the Messiah. Now what Paul is presenting here, and remember, he's going through all of the evidence. So he's not just making this up, and he's not just trying to bring them to a point that he's not familiar with. The scriptures themselves, going through the Old Testament, point to a Messiah not who would come charging in on a white horse and conquering Rome with the swing of a sword. They point to a Messiah who would suffer and die and be resurrected for all mankind. Not for an earthly kingdom, but for a heavenly kingdom. And so, again, Paul is just hyperlinking all of those places. And so then, once he does that, as he's going through those on these 3 Sabbaths, he can then point to the historical death and resurrection of Jesus to show that he is the Messiah, or the Christ, as he says here. Okay? So that is what Paul is concluding. Now let's see how he concludes it. Because Luke uses, well, I guess Paul himself uses a pretty emphatic word here, okay? So proclaim, katagelio, an emphatic public declaration. So Paul isn't simply presenting an academic case for who Jesus is. While he is presenting evidence, this isn't merely academic to him. He's not just interested in being right and having all the right answers and being able to fill in all the blanks in his little class book, okay? He believes what he is teaching here. And in believing that, he also believes that he must proclaim that to people that he is teaching about that. So he's not simply presenting an academic case. He has reasoned through the Scriptures himself, and he is fully dedicated to proclaiming Jesus. Okay? Paul is all in. And so that's where he gets to with this. I've shown you what the Scriptures are. I've shown you where the Scriptures lead. I have talked to you about who those Scriptures point to and about the historical figure who did exist, not but probably 20 years prior to this, and did suffer at the hands of the Jews and at Rome, and did die and was resurrected. And so just based on those facts, Paul says, I commend this to you. What are you going to do with it? Well, then we see the result. Verse 4. Some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. Paul's successful. Okay? So Paul goes through this process, and it works for some of these folks. One final point that I want to make about this, in particular the word proclaim. There is a passage in 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that talks about proclaiming Jesus. Anybody know what that passage is or what that passage is talking about? 1 Corinthians 11. It gets read many a Sunday in the middle of services. When we take the Lord's Supper. That's right. Okay? So with all of this in mind, thinking about how Paul himself has been through the Scriptures, he has reasoned through them, and yes, Paul had an experience on the road to Damascus for sure. I don't want to discount that. But I'm sure that after that experience, Paul started to go through the Scriptures and think about things in a way that he had never thought about them before and start connecting the dots. And once he did, that faith was just that much more solidified in Jesus and his mission. Okay? So, when we consider what Paul's reaction now to that is, the fact that he wants to go from place to place and establish churches and go back to those churches, and what ends he's willing to go through to do that, the amount of suffering that he's willing to go through, the amount of hardship that he's willing to undergo to proclaim this message. And then he tells the Corinthian brethren, and then consequently us as well, you proclaim Jesus until he comes every time you partake of the Lord's Supper, every time you participate in the Lord's Supper. Just kind of put those together and realize what we're doing with that. We are communing together, but we are also proclaiming that we have reasoned through the Scriptures. We have come to belief in who Jesus is and what he did and what he continues to do. And we are now proclaiming, I'm following him too. I believe that he is Lord, and I am proclaiming that by taking this supper. So, I don't know, just kind of drawing those connections for me is interesting. Just maybe help to give a little bit more context to our worship and how we do that. Eddie.
I'm like you, I like word studies.
Yeah.
And I don't read Greek, don't understand it, but I do like to look and see the Greek words because they're usually compound words. Mm-hmm. And this word word proclaim has the same root as the word evangelize.
Yes.
But as you mentioned, this has an emphatic prefix on it, the kata, which is simply saying evangelize in capital letters.
Mm-hmm.
That's really what he's talking about here. So this message, in the way that we simply live our lives as Christians, is proclaiming Christ.
Yep. And it's the same word from which we get the word angel or messenger. And basically, this is basically the angel shout, is basically what the word means when you break it apart. It is the angelic message. And so the message that I present to you. So yes. But yeah, it's the same root word also as evangelism. That is true. We haven't got to Berea yet. Are you kidding me? Okay. All right. That's okay. Because let's move forward then in our text. Okay. Some of the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob. So here, as we've seen with some of the other cities, the Jewish contingent in that city is divided. Some follow Paul and listen to his teaching and are converted. Some are not willing to listen at all. Okay? And so what we see then is some are persuaded, some are not. Opposition to the message, though, is not because Paul has poorly presented it or because he has inaccurately presented it. It does not have to do with the substance of the message itself or Paul's ability to express it. Well, it may have some to do with the substance of the message. But what we're seeing here in the description is the same thing that happens to Jesus, because the Jews of his day were also described as acting out of jealousy. And we even see them say at some point, if these people continue to go after Jesus, we're going to lose our place. We're going to get left behind. And we're not going to have the same place that we do in the Roman hierarchy. So jealousy of the response to the message, that people's attention is now being taken away from the Jewish leaders in Thessalonica, prompts unbelieving Jews to form a mob to silence Paul by thuggish force. Okay? They don't like the message. They don't like what Paul is saying. They don't refute it with Scripture. They refute it with force. Okay? This mob mentality. And the word there for the rabble, I like this. It's the agorion. The agora is the marketplace. And so these people are literally market loungers. They go get the riffraff that are lying around the market, and they probably pay them to rile everybody up and start acting out against Paul. So let's look at what they have to say, though. Their allegation is these men, they bring them before the city authorities, and they say these men who have turned the world upside down have come here also, and Jason has received him, and they are all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another King Jesus. Now, this is a very ironic description on many levels, but just to point out a few things, okay? First of all, what they are saying is half-ish true, mostly not, okay? Paul is not preaching that they need to go overthrow Caesar or any of those types of things, but he is preaching about a new king. Not a new king. He is preaching about a different type of king. So that is true. The thing, though, is that what they have to say and how they say it is specifically designed to alarm the local magistrates. Now, at this time, looking at Rome, Emperor Claudius is the ruler in Rome at this point. Okay? Now, just a year prior to these events, we're about 50 to 51 AD. So in AD 49, Claudius issued an edict that all Jews were to be expelled from Rome. He has no love for the Jewish population because he sees them as rabble-rousers. He wants nothing to do with them, and so he kicks them all out of Rome and expels them. When we get to Acts chapter 18, we're going to see Aquila and Priscilla. That's why they're where they are in Corinth, is because they have been expelled from Rome due to Claudius's edict. So it is well known Claudius has no love for the Jews or for their their bickering and those types of things. Now, the word that's used here, that they use to describe Paul, is suggests revolutionary behavior with the intent to overthrow Roman rule. They are playing on the fears of the politicians because they don't want to be seen as disturbing or breaking the Pax Romana. If you remember what the Pax Romana is, it is the worldwide peace that everyone enjoys under the auspices of Rome. Because if you don't enjoy that peace, or you breach that peace, or break that peace, you will be broken by Rome. That's how they keep peace. It is peace at the point of a sword. And so the folks in Thessalonica, the politicians there, do not want Rome's attention brought down on them in a negative way. And so they say, we don't want this, we don't want to deal with this. You need to do something. Now, they go looking for Paul. They can't find him. Presumably he's been stashed away by the brethren, or he is outside of the city or something like that. And so they bring Jason. Jason is most likely the Thessalonican brother whose home that they are staying at and who has been welcoming them and taking care of them while they're in Thessalonica. And so they bring Jason out and force him to give a bond, basically saying, pay us this money and get Paul out of the city or you're going to lose everything. Okay, so Jason does pay this bond, and then the brethren there do not escort, that's not a good word. They take Paul and his companions and wish them well on their way. Okay? It is shortly after these events in Thessalonica, I mean within a few weeks, maybe months, that Paul writes the letters 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Okay? So when you read Acts chapter 17, this brief account of the events that happened in Thessalonica, and then you go and read 1 Thessalonians in particular, you will see direct connections, because they are very recent in Paul's history, direct connections to the events that take place here. Paul is extremely complimentary of the Thessalonian brethren for how they handled this situation and how they continue to love and exhort one another and care for the church. And indeed, at some point, Paul sends Timothy back there in the weeks before he goes on to Corinth. And Timothy is speaking with these people and just kind of checking in on them. And Timothy brings back a very favorable report according to 1 Thessalonians chapter 3. Okay? So go back and read 1 and 2 Thessalonians, add some context to this story for yourself, and see that Thessalonica was not a failure on Paul's part any more than any of the other cities. There was a church there. That church did thrive with its membership there. Most likely Jason is one of those members that's talked about in the book of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, as well as some of the other brethren that we're going to see here in a few chapters in Acts. Okay, so next week we're going to get to Berea, and we're also going to get to Athens and talk about both of those. So thank you for indulging me, and thank you for your comments tonight.